Most Holy Weeks and Easter seasons that I walk through or journey through with communities have a theme that kind of emerges out of them as I walk through them with people. And one of the things that struck me as we journeyed together through Holy Week and Easter this year was the significance of the spaces between. So the breaths between the different movements and significant events of Jesus' ministry and life and death and resurrection and today his ascension. Speaking to the sacred spaces of waiting that many of us find ourselves in and that we as children of God are called into as we live life together in community in this world and culture that we find ourselves. For the disciples, there was a waiting for Christ to be taken and crucified when they were with him. There was a waiting for his resurrection to happen. And here, this brilliant moment of ascension that in a sense leaves them waiting again. But they're not waiting in a void, but in a culture and a space in which God calls them to live in the space between heaven and earth. They've journeyed with Christ to the cross and beyond it. They've spent several days with the risen Christ in body as he taught them what the kingdom of God might look like after his departure. Abiding with one another and loving one another as Christ has loved us. And then finally, this dramatic and joyful moment of Christ ascending into his eternal home with his God and Father. In that very moment, Christ's followers were called to live into the space of tension between two worlds. A vision of heaven, where every tear is wiped away from our eyes, all things are made new, where Christ has gone to prepare a place for us in our Father's house and in our Father's heart. But we're also called in that space and time to live into this broken and beautiful world that we find ourselves. A world with injustice and violence and loneliness and systems that ensnare us. And that space in between these two worlds is full of divine possibilities for us. It's the place of faith and hope that grounds us in the good, the bad, and the ugly experiences that we live, and that keep us working towards and hoping for that eternal goodness of God. But I think this call to enter into the space and tension between heaven and earth, we respond to that differently. Because when we look at this story, the stories in Acts and Luke today, there are different responses to this moment where Christ ascends. Some are left fixated and staring up to the heavens that Jesus had just departed to. The reading of Acts, the message of the angels is, "Why do you stand here looking up towards heaven?" Jesus will return the same way that you have just witnessed him departing. And in a sense, when I hear this, I'm reminded of the sect of Christianity that seems to be fixated on heaven or the life after death. And there's a sense of health in that sometimes, and that we have faith and we have hope that we're called into and belong in God after our death. But sometimes it goes into a way or a space where that theology dismisses or diminishes the human experience. We're so fixated on believing the right things and behaving the right way to obtain salvation. But essentially it's fueled by the fear of the opposite. And all the while, we fail to enter into or build the kingdom of God that is here and now. I've been a part of an emergent theology group. It's called Pyrotheology. And I go to Belfast in Northern Ireland every other year to a boutique conference put on by, his name's Peter Rowlands, and he's a a philosopher and theologian that holds a conference there. And it's a small conference, 50 people from around the world, and it's based in Belfast. And it's structured after the notion of an Irish wake or a funeral. And the conference is designed to present how Christian ideas have intersections with different movements in our culture that we find ourselves. So it pulls together people from completely different backgrounds to discuss and to kind of work through how our beliefs work with and intersect with one another. So it's hard to believe that it can be fulfilling, but it is. To look at how my Christian ideas intersect with the death of God movement, with atheism, with the postmodern culture's critique of the ways religion has failed. And when I was there at this one conference, the first one I was at, he said something that stuck with me for a while. It's been 4 years now. And he said, Peter Rollins said, the question isn't, is there life after death? But the question is life before death possible? So really taking that notion of heaven and pushing it into our realities here and now. Which drives us to the questions, how does our faith in God, in humanity's eternal belonging in God, impact or direct the ways that we live our lives now? How do we own and grow into and live in that space that God has called us to in this world, companioning with the oppressed and the poor and the needy, living in the system that creates immense wealth and disparity? How do we live into that space where we journey with one another in that tension between heaven and earth, as we grieve and as we hope and as we grow? In our Acts and Luke readings today, I hear a call to go out and to be Jesus' hands and feet and heart in our world. And by that action, transforming human suffering. Because the wounded and the suffering Christ has now ascended and is held in God's story. And the claim about Jesus' ascension is a claim about relationship. Jesus' relationship in God, and God's relationship in us. Jesus returning to God's right hand. Jesus is meant to be with God, and so are we. God entering into the human condition, showing us that God is meant to dwell in humanity here. And Jesus rising to God with his body, his strength, his relationships, his wounds and scars, showing us that humanity is also meant to dwell in God. The wholeness of our humanity, which is, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so we wait, suspended between earth and heaven, waiting with anticipation in the incompleteness and brokenness and beauty of our world, grounded in hope and waiting for what God is up to next. Because now God is active in the life of God's believers. God is active in us. And the story isn't finished yet. Amen.